My name is Arturo Thompson. I am the Dean of Career Development at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah, and I am your host today, along with SIPLA, which is our Student IP Law Association, which is an amazing group of students focused on IP law, and the office that I oversee, the Office of Career Development here at the U. I want to welcome you on behalf of us, on behalf of the entire S.J. Quinney community, as well as the Dean, who could not join us today. She's out of town, and deeply regrets, as I was telling Britton earlier, not meeting Britton because she's a deeply obsessive NFL fan. For the students who've seen the back of her truck, it's the one that talks about the deeply obsessive NFL fan. You can't miss it. We started talking about this program, myself and my colleague here on my right, Trinity Jordan, about 2 years ago, not long after we met, probably somehow related to a TCU versus KU bet. And I think at that time I had to wear the funny hat with the horned toad or whatever it is. So we're excited to finally bring this to fruition. It's an exciting program. He will introduce our speakers. He will be our MC this evening. For those of you who are participating in the room and online, we're going to be using Slido. If you're not familiar with it, it's a way to basically enter your questions. And if someone else enters a question you like, you can promote it by liking it, and it'll move it up in the question queue. You go to slido.com, they'll have that projected up there eventually. And the code you'll be looking for is really straightforward, NIL 2024. And that'll let you get into the Slido program and be able to contribute questions. And with that, I'm going to hand the stage off to my colleague, Trinity.
Welcome. It's good to have everyone here. I want to introduce our distinguished panel that we have here today. First up is Professor George Contreras. George Contreras is the James T. Jensen Endowed Professor for Transactional Law and Director of the Program on Intellectual Property and Technology Law. Utah's Distinguished Research Award, and is elected member of the American Law Institute. He's testified before the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Intellectual Property and was awarded the Rossman Memorial Award by the Patent and Trademark Office Society in 2022. We also have Britton Covey, wide receiver, punt returner for the Philadelphia Eagles, and formerly with the University of Utah Utes. Britton Covey's a wide receiver and punt return specialist for the Eagles and a former Ute. Born in Provo, Utah, Britton chose to attend the University of Utah, though he was down in Provo. Britton left Utah to pursue his dream of playing in the NFL, where he signed with the Philadelphia Eagles as an undrafted free agent. And during his 2 years in the NFL, Britton has established himself as a dynamic punt return specialist. Britton is currently preparing for his third NFL season. We also are joined by Maddie Hansen. Maddie is the Executive Director of Branding and Player Relations for the Crimson Collective. And for a decade, Maddie Hansen served as the Creative Director for the Utah Football, leaving an enduring mark on the program with her innovative ideas and strategic vision. In July of 2023, she became the Director of Branding and Player and Community Relations with the Crimson Collective. She finds joy and fulfillment in supporting and promoting all aspects of Ute sports, especially the athletes themselves. We're also joined by, via Zoom, Mark Reisman. Mark Reisman is a licensed practicing attorney in California and Nevada and is known for his celebrity clientele from the sports and entertainment fields. He has chaired several professional committees and government boards, and as a professor, he's taught hotel law and sports law at major Pac-12 University Law School. And then last on our panel, but certainly not least, is Russ White. Russ White is the president of Encore Marketing, and he's also the president of the Collective Association, which I believe there's 34 different collectives part of the Collective Association, correct? 35 as of today. 35 as of today. It's growing. Encore Marketing is a sports marketing agency that provides talent representation, brand consulting, and NIL collective solutions. Since the fall of 2021, Encore has advised, launched, and operated more than 8 NIL collectives across the country, including 5 at the Power 4 level. Russell also serves as the president of the collective association with 35 collectives, helping lead the trade association's efforts to advocate on behalf of NIL collectives and collegiate athletes nationwide. My name is Trinity Jordan. I work in many areas of legal representation as a partner at Armstrong Teasdale, including in the area of entertainment and sports law. Our firm represents universities, professional athletes, collegiate athletes, players associations, entertainment studios, social media influencers, professional sports teams, and the likes regarding their rights. My career in sports law started with the University of Miami's Athletic Compliance Office. I was part of a team that was brought in during the wake of some of those issues at the U. Thank you, 30 for 30. My current sports passion is being assigned to the Angels organization and serving as the chaplain to the Salt Lake Bees. Their home opener is tomorrow night. All right. As we'll start, we're going to have Professor Contreras come and talk to us a little bit about the history behind NIL.
All right. Well, thanks for that kind introduction. And thanks to you all for coming. So, spend about 10 minutes or so having a little bit of law school here before we get to the really interesting stuff with these folks. So, we hear about NIL in the news. It's all over the place these days. And but very few people, it turns out, actually know what it is. And I'm not sure I know what it is. But let's see this. Here we go. But, we can trace the origins of this thing way back to the beginning of the 20th century, right? This was a privacy-related right. It turns out, flour companies would take pictures of women and put them on flour bags and sugar bags without their permission. This caused the New York legislature to get upset and passed a law that said you couldn't use an individual's name, portrait, or picture in trade without their written consent. It was the first law that we had like this on the books. The first case that anyone's heard of that was enforced this law was the Binns versus Vitagraph case, a 1909 case involving the telegraph officer on this ship that collided with another ship. He was kind of a hero at the time, and a movie was made about him without his permission, and he successfully invoked this statute to get some money out of it. But it wasn't until the 50s, with the rise of baseball trading cards and players selling their rights to trading card companies, that we actually recognized this thing called a right of publicity as something you could sell, right? Not just a personal privacy right, but an asset that you could actually bank. And the New York, or the Second Circuit in this case, acknowledged that you've got a right in publicity, in your photograph, your name, and your biography. It's an economic right. You can sell it, not just a privacy claim, and it can be enforced by whoever buys that right? So this is a case between two trading card companies involving hundreds of different players. They got $1 plus a wristwatch for the sale of their right for use on baseball cards. So today, we've come a long way since the 50s. Under federal law, we've got the Lanham Act, which we generally know of as a trademark statute, but it also prohibits false endorsements. So you can't say an athlete endorses your product without permission under the Lanham Act. But more importantly, right of publicity statutes exist in about 24 states, and a lot of the other states have common law rights that create these. The scope of protection is pretty broad, right? And it varies from state to state. Here in Utah, name, picture, or portrait are recognized by the statute, but other states have much broader rights in their right of publicity, everything from your signatures to your voice, the sound of your voice. Courts around the country have recognized like taglines. Johnny Carson, the nighttime host, was able to prevent the use of his moniker, Here's Johnny, and the Here's Johnny portable toilet company. Samsung was sued by Vanessa White, the Wheel of Fortune hostess, by creating a robot with a blonde wig for an ad that evoked her, even though the robot really doesn't look anything like her. So it's become a very broad right and enforced in the courts all around the country. So licensing, of course, is big business for NIL these days. Primarily, action figures, apparel, all of these things require license under someone's name, image, and a likeness to it to be produced. But a lot of the real money in the past came from video games. Electronic Arts had a very popular series of video games, NCAA basketball and football. that we'll see in a second got discontinued when they ran afoul of this right. So now how does the NCAA come into this NIL picture? So again, there's a lot of history here as well. And since the 1880s or so, colleges paid players on their sports teams, right? Harvard, Yale, famous football game. Harvard and Yale paid people to come play for their teams. And the fans loved it, the students loved it, but it was starting to cause some problems. The schools got together in the 20s and said, we should really only have amateur players, but there was no enforcement mechanism for that. So it wasn't until 1948, the NCAA, as we know it, created something called the Sanity, not the Sanitary Code, the Sanity Code, right? And said players at colleges should not be compensated, there shouldn't be financial aid based on athletic ability, and if a school doesn't comply with this, they can be expelled from the NCAA. So it was a very tough rule and an important new rule. It loosened up over the years so that by the 50s, scholarships covering tuition, fees, and books were allowed, but still strongly prohibited other types of compensation. Okay, so NCAA amateurism rules were challenged in court, since the 80s. The first case involved NCAA's television rules, where they would cap the total number of games that a school could broadcast on TV, challenged under the antitrust laws. The Supreme Court heard this case and said, number one, amateurism is a revered tradition in college sports, right? Consistent with the goals of the Sherman Act. That's our antitrust act. Nevertheless, the NCAA's TV rules did violate the act. The restrictions on the number of games that could be televised were not consistent with this rule. But this case is really important because it establishes that amateurism is a legitimate pro-competitive goal that the NCAA can have. So that brings us to some more recent cases. The O'Bannon case, brought in California on behalf of a large class of student athletes, involved the NCAA's licensing of their NIL to EA for its NCAA sports video games. NCAA, through its licensing company, collected significant amounts of money for these licenses, but didn't share any of that revenue with the players as a result of their amateurism rules. And the players sued the NCAA as a result. Under the right of publicity claims, the licensing agency, CLC, which is an NCAA entity, and Electronic Arts, they settled their case, right, for about $40 million, and resulted in NCAA terminating its relationship with Electronic Arts, which is why we haven't seen an NCAA game for video players in quite a while. But the antitrust suit went on, and the players sued the NCAA itself for prohibiting them from collecting revenue for their NIL. It's an anti-competitive restraint of trade among the schools that formed the NCAA. And so the Supreme Court hears this case and says, we got to balance anti-competitive versus pro-competitive effects with any kind of restriction like this. And the anti-competitive effect is, look, if the NCAA didn't prohibit schools from paying players, schools could compete by offering more money to players, just like they did back in the 19th century. The pro-competitive justification for the compensation rules is, well, look, amateurism, as the court said back in '84, amateurism is important. It plays a role in preserving the popularity of the NCAA product. So in this case, right, in O'Bannon, the the Supreme Court upheld NCAA's restrictions on compensation, except that it had to allow schools to pay players compensation up to their cost of attendance, right? Tuition, room and board, and so forth. That restriction had to fall by the wayside, but other compensation around NIL was still not allowed. So that brings us to the Alston case, right, which is more recent. Here, this is a broad challenge to all NCAA compensation limits. It's not limited to NIL, like the O'Bannon case was. The district court in that case said NCAA can't restrict schools from paying education-related compensation, even if it's above their cost of attendance. So, for example, payments that happen after their undergraduate years, tutoring, internship payments, and so forth. The district court said, we're loosening the restrictions. NCAA can't restrict that, but it can continue to restrict non-educational compensation like pure athletic scholarships paid by schools and other compensation from boosters, right? Non-school related compensation. Affirmed by the Ninth Circuit, Supreme Court says, amateurism, we go back to our old cases, still an important pro-competitive justification. NCAA's original restraints on player compensation were too strict, though, so this injunction is upheld. It does still give the NCAA pretty much leeway to restrict those third-party payments, define what the scope of education is, but also restrict things like, the Lamborghini test. Can a school give an in-kind benefit unrelated to education, like a car, to a student? We'll talk more about that. Interesting footnote to the case, though, is Justice Kavanaugh, in his concurring opinion, questions the whole idea of amateurism, right? And this is probably where the cases are going next. Is amateurism actually still legitimate when NCAA schools make billions of dollars off of these games and performance, and the people who are actually performing don't get anything? So Justice Kavanaugh, big baseball fan, has thrown up this question. Lots of reaction to these cases from the NCAA and elsewhere. The policy that the NCAA enacted as an interim policy in 2021 said that athletes could engage in NIL transactions without loss of eligibility. They can use agents, but the institutions, the schools, still can't compensate them for their NIL. Led to a spate of state legislation around NIL. I won't go into this in any detail. States have approached this in a variety of ways. The federal government, there are at least 5 bills pending before Congress the last time I checked, with a range of different loosening and tightening of the restrictions. And then most recently, another class action certified in Tennessee last November, challenging, again, prohibitions on schools compensating athletes for NIL, asking to revoke that interim policy, and trying to look back and get compensation for pre-2021 NIL that players were unable to contract for. 184,000 present and past athletes in this class. So this is definitely a big deal. Just a couple of months ago, the Ninth Circuit upheld the class certification, so I think we'll hear more about this as we move on. But, trial here scheduled January of 25. What's going to happen is anybody's guess, but hopefully that at least sets up what some of the issues and questions are for the rest of our panel. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. Well, now that you all know what NIL is, we can all go home. That was perfect. I want to start off asking some questions, but before I do, I'm going to readily admit I'm being provocative in this, but probably some of you didn't know this, and I had to do my research on this as I was walking through this whole concept of the NCAA and where we've had for its restrictions for athletes. Walter Byers was the executive director for the NCAA from 1951 until 1988. He was the first executive director of the NCAA. In fact, he ran the NCAA with total control. We wouldn't have the institution of the NCAA without Walter. He's the one that negotiated TV contracts, and he's the one that we learned preempted universities for how many games that they could broadcast on television. He's the one that led the NCAA to fight this in the U.S. Supreme Court. He took the NCAA from being just this low-level group of universities coming together to a multi-billion-dollar business. In 1995, I don't know how many of you know this, but he wrote a tell-all book. It was called Unsportsmanlike Conduct, Exploiting College Athletes. He's the one that came up with the term student athlete. In fact, he did it to insulate universities from providing long-term disability payments to players that were injured in action. But once he wrote his famous book, and now it's been quoted over and over and over in litigation, he referred to the NCAA, the thing that he had created, a nationwide money laundering scheme. And he asked Congress to free the athletes. And he wanted to enact the College Athletes Bill of Rights. And he advised that deregulation of a monopoly business operated by not-for-profit institutions contracting together to achieve maximum financial returns. And this was the NCAA. And he admitted that the NCAA's collegiate amateurism was just an economic camouflage for this monopoly practice. I start with that to our esteemed panel. We'll start with something simple, right? Where are we currently? Maybe I'll start with you, Russ, and then open it up to everybody else. Where are we currently with the NCAA and this regulation? Where do you see us moving and growing? We've had total control with the NCAA, and it feels like the last few years this is opening up, including what we've just learned with NIL.
Yeah, that was a great introduction. Good work on that. Walter Byers is a figure that those of us in the space are familiar with, and I haven't read the book yet fully, but I'm excited to. Where we are today, there's a lot of, I think, opportunity at the federal level now. I think, as we talked about a little bit, Trinity, beforehand, there's a renewed appetite, I believe, in Congress to see if there's a space for them, if it's necessary for them to step in. I think that to this point, they've done a good job of not overstepping in opportunities where they were in spaces where they've had the opportunity to. On the state level, that map that we showed earlier about the states that were involved, I think there were, this last legislative session, about 13 different states that we consulted with on state laws. And so at the state level, a lot of that was retracting laws that were now more restrictive than the NCAA interim policy, which is kind of no longer in existence to a point. And so I think that legislatively, as far as Congress or at the state level goes, I think there's movement. In an election year, I don't know that anything gets done. I was part of a roundtable a couple weeks ago in D.C. with Senator Cruz, where we went through his draft bill with his team, and a couple months before that sat with Senator Booker's team about the College Athlete Bill of Rights, which is a big part of his ideas behind some legislation. And I think that there are some thoughtful people in the discussion now at that level, which is a very good thing. Whether anything happens this year, I'm not optimistic. I also don't know that I want, personally, that I'm in favor with something happening. But I think that there may be a role there where previously we didn't. I think that there's movement afoot, and I think that the Tennessee case and some of these other things have really brought that back to the forefront for politicians.
That's great. Let me open this up for everybody, and I'll ask a much more broader question. I think everyone's probably got an opinion on this. What are the benefits of NIL for collegiate athletes today?
Yeah, well, I think, right, as someone who played most of my career without NIL being a possibility, and then the last year it was available, and I really missed out on quite a bit. Really sad about it. It was always frustrating as an athlete. You did feel like you were being taken advantage of in a way, right? Especially, it was never at the school level or anything, but it was the NCAA. The NCAA and the athletes, there's this disconnect, major disconnect between the NCAA and the athletes, and there still is. And it felt like you were a little bit exploited. And so opening that up in 2021 was exciting, but it was like the wild, wild west, right? It was scrambling every which way, calling businesses saying, hey, do you want to sponsor me? And no one knew what you were doing. And I laugh when I look back at it because I had to scratch and claw to make Russ was my marketing agent, to make a couple grand and do all these things. And I had my checklist of things I needed to do for the businesses. And I'm like, this is great. This is NIL. Now I look at the contracts that some of these players are getting, and I am just shocked. They make more than I do in the NFL. And so it still is a little bit of the wild, wild west. I definitely think there's some benefits. But I also think that there are some things that hurt the regular everyday college athlete, not the top earners, right? You probably could name 5, 10 athletes here at the U. NIL really benefits them. The other ones, there's still stuff to figure out. So
That's good. That's good. Mark, do you have an opinion on what are the benefits for NIL for collegiate athletes?
Well, it's compensation in its various forms, and with the collectives, they don't have to do the side hustle like was just spoken about. As far as the future, the NIL, or excuse me, the NC2A always had a disconnect, it seemed to me, from the universities, and they were almost sometimes in a contrarian position to the universities, where they would discipline coaches like Jim Harbaugh or Jerry Tarkanian through the years. I think the colleges themselves, the universities, are going to have to sort of regain control of the NC2A for NIL, for portal transfers, for all the issues that are coming up, unionization. And I think we're going to see also sort of a separation between the, halves like, Florida, Alabama, USC, with some of the other schools. And that's where I think the future may be. And the benefit to the student athlete, of course, is compensation.
That's good. Maddie, you've probably got a lot to say to this, running the Crimson Collective. So what are the benefits to our collegiate athletes?
Yeah, just a few things. I think that, to Britton's point, we talked about this a little earlier, but I think that you hear about the top 10%, you hear about those guys that are making lots of money, but only a very, very insignificant amount of kids that play collegiate sports actually make it to the next level. And I think that NIL has benefited those guys and gals who have aspirations of making it to the next level but don't necessarily get there. They can make money while they're in school. They can set themselves up for their future more successfully than they could prior to NIL.
I was going to say that I think that's one of the biggest values is you do hear about the large amounts of money, but then you don't hear as many stories about the other athletes that are making valuable connections, are earning a little bit of money on the side, or maybe having the opportunity to see different career paths, different opportunities for their future on how they plan to take that next step in life after they're finished playing sports. I think it's 2 to 3% of athletes probably make it professional, and that leaves a very high number of athletes who have worked extremely hard to get to where they are and perform at the level they have and accomplish so many things that are now left with what's next. And I think the NIL opens a ton of doors outside of just the money in their pocket. That's a huge value. Obviously, compensation is massive, and especially coming from a place of not being able to be compensated, and now you can. I think that's a huge piece that they get. But I think the experience, the networking, the other opportunities that come along with that are nearly as valuable for the athletes.
yeah, I also agree with that. And I think it's really easy to look at this objectively and agree that the athletes back in the day, it was a little extreme. I remember not being able to put my name when I was working. I was actually the assistant for President Randall when he was the dean of the business school. I was his assistant. That was my internship. And I wasn't able to even advertise my name on one of the projects that I was working on because of NIL restrictions, right? Because, Britton Covey's name on this project will attract more people to this event. And so they're using his name, image, and likeness to generate revenue. And it was like any other student would be, even if this student was, well known for something they did in the community aside from the university, would be able to put their name on and use. So obviously, I think most people can be reasonable and look at that objectively and say that's a little extreme, especially if there's a third party business, right? Some car company wants to sponsor me that has nothing to do with the university, I think everybody can be like, well, yeah, this person, you know, it's not in connection with the university. They should be able to use their name, image, and likeness. Where it gets tricky is when it's used for recruiting. And I think that is the big issue that most people want to talk about these days is everything that has to do with recruiting these days is all about how much money can you get me. I talked to Coach Whittingham. I talked to plenty of coaches around the country and people. And all NIL has become, in a way, is how much money do you need for you to come play for our school? And that's not the real initial goal of NIL, which is to use your name, image, and likeness to be able to have brand deals and things like that. It's just, okay, what company do we need to get on board so that they can pay you this so you can come here? It's just this weird, you know, that's, I think, the hard conversation that needs to be had is, should there be regulations? And if there should, do we really trust the NCAA to do those regulations? Anyways, that's just my 2 cents on that topic.
Well, that's why we have you here, is we want to hear it. So I want to stay in this lane because I got questions about collectives. Probably all of us here want to know what a collective is and how they're funded and all this stuff. But we'll stay in this lane because you brought this up, Britton, when you talked about it. Nick Saban has been famous for talking about this specific issue that you brought up. He did it at the round table in DC recently. He did it in an interview with ESPN, and he used this example, and I'm going to butcher his example, but he said when he would be recruiting collegiate athletes, they would come to his house, their families would come to their house, he would have a meal with them, and his wife would take, you know, the moms in the back, and they would talk about how they're going to build these young men into men, and they're going to help them craft their brand and take care of them. And Nick Saban would tell this story about now those dinners don't exist. Now it's, how much money can you get me? So Nick Saban specifically said when he was in DC 2 weeks ago, or it was roughly 2 weeks ago, he called NIL and contribution to NIL just a pay-to-play scheme. Is this NIL just a pay-to-play scheme?
I'm going to let Russ start on this because he was at that roundtable discussion and he even talked with Coach Saban afterwards and clarified some comments and things. So you speak to that first and then I'll add.
We're talking about my friend Nick, my new friend Nick Saban. No, Coach Saban's awesome. He brings a lot, obviously, to the table. We did speak afterwards a little bit. It was interesting. We spoke beforehand, and he talked about collectives and his respect for certain, things and services that collectives provide. Then his testimony wasn't necessarily that. And then afterwards, made sure to clarify that, his issue is with the structure of NIL and the structure of collectives and the role they play, some of the limitations on how they work with schools and how donors are asked to make decisions where to put money and things of that nature. Which, again, my question to him was probably going to be along the lines of which one of your homes that you bought with your $10 million plus per year salary, that these kids helped you earn, did you have those dinners in? Did it shift? Did you different homes, or was it in the same home every time? But again, it's he has a good point in that I think a role of athletics, especially at the college level, has always been to help these men and women mature into full individuals, right? The whole athlete type approach. Help them in ways off the field, on the field, as much as you can. And I think that part of that has shifted, especially in the major sports, and football and basketball in particular, to how can I still, yes, I'd love to hear about how you're going to help me achieve more and become a better individual, but also like how much money am I going to make while I'm doing that? And to a point, I see where the athletes are coming from. I mean, there's been hundreds of millions, billions of dollars made every year off of their efforts. So I can see where they'd like to get a piece of that. At the same time, I think that the culture that is built by a coach, and I will point out, I think Coach Whittingham and Coach Scally and their staff here has done an incredible job. Like the value at the University of Utah, I mean, the Crimson Collectives, you guys are doing great things, but the culture, the Utah football program is top in the country, and I think that brings a lot of these athletes to Utah. I think that in other schools, they struggle with some culture issues, and maybe there it's more about the money. And that's unfortunate. It should be about kind of the whole picture, not just how much I'm getting paid or how much, I'm going to be turned into or help mold it into a better, contributing member of society, I guess. So it's a vague space there, I think, a little bit.
Yeah, and sorry.
No, you please.
Sure. Sorry, I'm sure I'm going to maybe answer some of the questions you'll probably ask me. This is just me talking out loud. The quiet part that people don't say out loud a lot of times, but having been around the NFL for a few years, is NIL was already happening in a lot of places that people didn't know about. I mean, this whole incentive to come play for our school, it was happening. I've talked to many players who were paid under the table, and now it's just more legal in the eyes of the NCAA, right? So that's what's funny is if you do make laws restricting that, I promise you it's still going to happen. At these big schools, you're still going to have boosters who are able to pay a person. There was even those dating back to LeBron James, right, with the Hummer. All of a sudden, he's driving a Hummer in high school, and everyone's wondering, how did you? Dating back years, this was already happening, and if there are rules put in place on this, it's still going to happen. So that's why I think you have to attack it from a different approach. If there is going to be some control in this, you don't, obviously there's the idea of professional versus amateurism. You don't attack just putting restrictions on NIL, that the school can't sponsor this or collectives, because it's still going to happen. You have to approach it from different ways. And so I've talked with Russ about my ideas of the transfer portal is the bigger issue in my mind than NIL by far. And I think that putting bylaws on that would solve, at least 50% of things. But if you attack NIL, you're just opening a can of worms, because it's still going to happen under the table like it was happening for the years before it. And I'm not going to ever disclose who I talked to about this, ever. So if anyone's watching this, don't ever ask me, but there are many people. So anyways, 2 cents on that.
I like when Britton
Can I
says
ask
just 2
Britton
cents.
a question? Traditionally, as Professor Contreras said at the beginning, NIL was if you're on a trading card or if you do a commercial or use of your name, image, and likeness in a truly commercial sense. Britton, I've learned that in professional football, yes, Jalen Hurts might get some great advertising opportunities. Jason Kelsey seems to be getting a lot of excess, more due to family relations and things like that. But the interior linemen, the offensive linemen, the special teams players, they're not asked to do a lot of commercials or things like that. And in college, NIL is far different than the traditional and legislative meaning historically. Like you said, you might make more on your base salary, but a college athlete is going to make more maybe in endorsement opportunities in NIL than you can on special teams. Mm-hmm. What's your feeling about that?
Yeah, well, and this is where I actually do believe that there is, whenever you come in, playing devil's advocate in this NIL conversation, everybody likes to say, oh, you're just this old school traditional, want athletes to work and grind. But that's not the case. It's I've seen the pros and cons of this. And I do think there are pros to even the linemen. And this is where I am in favor of collectives and things, is Russ especially sponsoring and organizing these collectives so that the whole offensive line gets paid. Like that was not going to happen without NIL. Obviously you're going to have the Cam Risings of the world who are making this much. Cam's deserves that, right? He's the face of Utah football. But before NIL, you weren't able to get these restaurants sponsoring the whole offensive line. You weren't able to do these things. So I am in favor of it. I still think it's important. I just think that even the NFL, professional athletes, there's not as much chaos and movement as there is in college. And so I still think there's a way to preserve amateur status while having certain bylaws that prohibit this chaos, where you can still have name, image, and likeness and sponsorships. But my thoughts are you limit the transfer portal opportunities, because the problem for me is when, say you're a coach and you go recruit this kid, and you spend all your effort to recruit this kid in high school, and you tell his parents, you do all these things, and he says, how much money can you get me? And you go and you help him get a deal, and you say, hey, I can get you this deal. You come here for $200,000. The kid comes, he plays his freshman year, he plays for you, you have a great experience, he gets his deal, and then at the end of the season, he comes into your office and says, hey, Alabama just told me they could get me $500,000 this next year to transfer. Can you match that? To me, that is the problem, is the fact that they are able to have such movement that even at the professional level, the contracts won't allow that. And so I think that you don't necessarily have to have contracts, which would make them professionals, right? You don't have to have contracts that would ground them to a university. The NCAA could make bylaws where you basically say you can't transfer until you've fulfilled 2 years at a school. I think that, because to me, the biggest problem is that when a player plays for a year, comes into and says, I did really good here, and now I've been noticed by a big school. They're offering me $500,000. Coach Whittingham, can you match that? That, to me, is the problem and the chaos that's created. And I think that if you were to have rules on the transfer portal, it would eliminate a lot of that chaos. Because what people don't think about in that scenario is, all right, so say Alabama offers you $500,000. Well, there's a high school kid in Alabama who just committed to Alabama. He doesn't know that this other kid's going to move across the country and is being paid $500,000. Those kids get forgotten about in this equation. All the walk-ons get forgotten about. And so, anyways, to me, it's attacking the transfer portal more than name, image, and likeness. Sorry, I don't want to feel like I'm rambling, but.
No, that's good. Professor, I want to ask you a question along that lines, because this isn't one of our prepared questions that we circulated, but it brings up something I think Britton talked about here. You know, who's regulating, or who should regulate this NIL? And let me ask that, it's a compound question, objection, I get it. But in this idea of transfer portal restrictions, does that going to implicate antitrust laws?
Yeah, good surprise question. So
That's what I'm good for.
yeah, exactly. So, you know, who enforces and who regulates this? I mean, traditionally, it's you know, the NCAA, like legally speaking, it's a consortium of schools. It's got its own identity, right? But it's the schools, and so I was actually wondering about this. Right, at some point, even transfer aside, even the initial recruitment fees, like they're not really for NIL. I mean, that's if NIL just starts to become a facade, a pretense for what's essentially just a payment, and if we're gonna, you know, if NCAA keeps its amateurism rules, which again is questionable, not sure that's actually going to happen, but if it does, then it does seem like NCAA could enforce, right? And NCAA has a huge amount of enforcement authority with respect to schools, but also players and their eligibility. So, you know, there is a stick if there were somebody who had the will to enforce. I think NCAA is kind of gun shy at this point. They're not really doing a lot of enforcement because they want to remain relevant. But they could, and they've got an enforcement stick. And I do think as the payments start to get bigger and they're less and less related to actual, as Mart said, you know, baseball cards or video games or T-shirts, it's going to be clear it's not really NIL, which is the exception that people are operating under. The transfer portal, you know, that really, it seems like a great idea in principle, but like most students, I mean, we do allow students to transfer schools all the time. Right? This is a fundamental piece of our educational system, and you know, you can always come up with an idea like the school just had a better chemistry program and I wanted to go there. It seems like it'd be pretty hard. And then you really are restricting athletes in a way that you're not restricting other students. And I think that would be pretty challenging. I don't know.
Hey, Trinity. Oh, wow, that was quite loud. Interesting question from the audience on another one of the unintended consequences, apart from the portal, was the effect of NIL on Title IX, and both, I think, for the gender disparity in sports, but also for smaller, less revenue potential generating athletics. So the audience would like to know, do you think NIL is going to exacerbate that inequality or improve it?
I'm happy to hop in on this one. I like this one. Some of the highest earners in NIL definitely are female athletes, but the majority of the money does go to male athletes. It is important, with collectives, this question gets brought up a lot of Title IX enforcement and Title IX ramifications. Collectives are not bound by Title IX as independent third parties. Although I've said this before and I'll continue to say it, and this is the position of the collective association and those collectives that are a part of it. Now, any good collective is funding female athletes the same way they are male athletes, to a point. It's not an equal revenue distribution. They're not paying everyone the same amount, but you'll be hard pressed to find a collective that is successful that is not taking care of female athletes in different sports. The Crimson Collectives, to use another example, I think a great thing they did with the truck deal that they had for the football team, they immediately had the similar opportunity available for women's basketball and gymnastics, I believe, right? And so, there's one of the collectives that
Were they trucks as well? Did they get trucks or did they get something cooler?
They got some cool.
They got a choice, actually. They could pick trucks or they could pick Jeep Cherokees. So they had options.
Yeah, see that's even a better spot to be in. You're not forced to take a truck. What if you don't like a truck? I think it was a great deal. Yeah, but some of the collectives we work with, and I'll just point out a couple. The Grove at Ole Miss does a great job. They just did a deal with the entire women's softball team. A lot of these collectives do work with all sports at their schools. Now, are they required to? No. Should they? Yes. And I think to whatever point each collective operates differently too. So, but I think that it is important to point out, while a lot of people will say things like, the women are being left behind or the female athletes aren't being taken care of. I don't necessarily see that happening. I do think that there is a higher percentage of revenue going to male athletes. I also think that if you look comparative to the revenue that's generated for the universities, there's probably a higher percentage of female athletes that are getting money through NIL than there is the amount of money that's being generated to the athletics department if those two things were to be tied together. But I think that most brands love to work with female athletes. They're valuable ambassadors for most brands. And so, I think that it's an issue that will be brought up a lot, but I think it's, as we go further and further down the track, it's that playing field is leveling out a bit more.
So, Maddie, I know you got to talk about this. The question I have that I want you to address too is, I think those in my office, we were talking about this very question before we got here today. And we were talking about what we think about when we think of youth sports and female athletics. And we think about gymnastics right away, and then women's basketball that they had a run in the tournament this year. So are they the two female sports that really are garnering the most NIL attention that's in our head? And can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that, yes, when you think about female athletics at the University of Utah, gymnastics is the first thing that comes to mind. They have an incredible history here. They do well every single year and have for quite some time. And they're really interesting, actually. They decided as a team that they were going to split all of their NIL evenly amongst every single one of their athletes, save for the international athletes, which I'm sure we will touch on later. But yes, so they are super interesting. And then women's basketball, they are awesome. Their program is wonderful. I've been working with them quite a bit just with this truck and Jeep deal. And I think that they do have, potential to earn quite a bit of money. But my interesting opinion on the Title IX situation is that I think NIL is what the athlete makes of it. I think that if the athlete goes out, the athlete pushes themselves, the athlete brands and markets themselves, they are more likely to get NIL money. And so I think, especially like Russ mentioned, you have a lot of female athletes that are high earners in the country, but I think that a big part of that is because they have pushed their name out there. They have pushed their image and likeness out into the world and garnered that attention for themselves. It's, I think, a little bit easier for football just because that is the biggest sport, the biggest game in the United States. But I think that that they have the potential there. It's just maybe requires a little bit more effort on their part.
I just have a question with all of this is I 100% agree that NIL helps any athlete in any sport, female, male, any sport, make of it what they will, like you said. I think part of what your question was referring to is any sport, male or female, that really doesn't have the potential to create NIL, talk about rowing or something at Stanford. Stanford has all these random sports in their program, right? And I don't know the financials behind, are they subsidized by any revenue generating sport at the school? And if, for example, football players became professionals and were no longer amateurs, would the football program subsidize any other sport after that? That's, I think, the question, because I agree that NIL will allow any athlete, male or female, in any sport, make of it what they will. But what about the dart throwing champion that probably is not going to get an NIL deal? Is his sport being subsidized by another sport or by the university? And how will that be affected if they're no longer amateurs or whatever?
No, it's good. I like this. And Mark, do you want to answer this question?
Could you repeat the question, Jordan?
Well, Britton was talking about the idea of having the different sports being subsidized by the revenue generating sports. So like football, I think I heard Alabama, the AD at Alabama a couple weeks ago talk about the football and basketball were their two sports that actually generate more money than they spend. And so is there going to be an issue with this? Britton, you said it way better than I did.
Yeah, well, I'm not, like I said, this is part of me asking with Title IX, isn't the idea that anything that is generating revenue has to be spread across evenly, whether that's across sports, across genders? How is that affected if there are changes and laws put into place, you be changed from amateurs to professionals? Will those continue to be subsidized, or will those fall by the wayside because they can no longer be sustainable? I think that's my question.
And it might be a rhetorical question too.
Yeah.
But.
And I think Britton's spot on. And I would have to say that I believe you're going to find some litigation arising sometime under this current system that is going to be a Title IX challenge, maybe not to the University of Utah. I can't predict which school, but there's going to be data that will support a differentiation between what the female athletes receive and the male athletes receive, and there will be a strong nexus established between the collective and the university, and you will see a Title IX challenge. It's something that maybe when the students graduate, they'll have a chance to brief and argue, but I think it's coming down.
I just quickly throw in, one of the arguments the schools made in resisting paying or allowing students to get the NIL payments is that, NIL was being sold before, right? It's just that the NCAA and the schools would keep the money, right? So in the electronic arts, the video game deals, millions of dollars, the game company would pay millions of dollars to the schools. And one of the schools' arguments to keep that structure in place was, we get all this money, but we then spread it around, right? We are subsidizing all of these other programs. And if that stops and it's instead the individual players get the money, which I personally think is the right thing, right? But if that happens, then the schools say, well, we used to have more ability to subsidize these other programs. Now we don't control the NIL anymore. It's going directly to the players. And so there's going to be less of that. So.
Russ, do you want to talk about the current EA Sports deal that exists out there? Because we are getting the game this summer. I mean, I've got my order. No,
I'm pretty excited about it. I'm a big college football. I'm not a big gamer, but that is, I will go on the record outside of Tiger Woods golf. That is the greatest game ever created for video games. So college football
Amen.
coming back is big. I don't think the payments were as big as they should have been. $600 and a free copy of the game. You mentioned earlier the trading card. They got $1 and a wristwatch. I leaned over and said, "At least they got a wristwatch." Like these guys are. I mean, again,
Jeans watch.
yeah. There are, and I'm not sure how many from Utah, Maddie, or some from Utah. There were some athletes who were paid extra to promote the game on top of what their $600 plus a free copy deal in the group licensing agreement is, and I think those payments were probably more in line with what athletes should be paid for this. But again, EA held all the cards. Everyone wants the game, and now that kids can make money, they can make an offer, and it could be accepted. And again, for I think it's 85 players per roster that will be maybe up to 100, but at least 85 will be eligible to be included in the game. So still, I don't think every player will. And every player had the option, the opportunity to opt out if they didn't want to accept that. So I think it's a great step forward. One thing back to, one thing that we hear a lot of on the revenue being spread across the athletic departments and how that money's being spent and what impact NIL could have on those types of things. One thing that gets brought up a lot is the Olympic movement, right? And the U.S. Olympic model, where we are one of the only, if not the only country that the government doesn't sponsor or contribute finances towards funding the Olympics, Olympic sports. And the NCAA, member institutions and their sports, and I don't know if rowing's an Olympic sport, but like fencing, is it? Yeah, fencing. I mean, pretty much everything but football and basketball, right? It's kind of this training ground for athletes where they can train and perfect their craft and improve. You see it in gymnastics a lot, where they maybe compete at the college level and then go train for the Olympics or are Olympians prior to college. And I think that there's this idea that goes away or gets damaged if athletes are now being paid and, money's not being spread. Jim Phillips, the commissioner of the ACC at our roundtable, talked about how in the ACC they sponsor 28 sports, I believe was the number. And then in one fiscal year, if you were to require universities to pay athletes as employees and under a Title IX restriction of equal, to male and female athletes, that he could pay football, and then I think he mentioned 2 or 3 women's sports. And he said we could go from a 28-sport athletic department to a 6-sport athletic department in one fiscal year. Seems dramatic to me, but, because there's other ways to make that money. But I think that there's things being talked about that maybe some of them are on the edges of where reality is of how this would look. But I do think that, it's important to keep in mind that with Title IX being an equal opportunity, right, for male and female athletes, I think that, like Maddie pointed out, NIL does create an equal opportunity for male and female athletes to go find deals, to hustle. She's exactly right when she says the athletes who put themselves out there, male or female, regardless of sport, have the opportunity to earn money and create, an NIL driven brand for themselves. And so, yeah.
Let me ask the question. I'm thinking about things that have all been said here about I'll start with Britain started with that it was the wild, wild west your last year in NIL, and you're out there hustling and calling and saying, hey, you want me? I'll be a brand ambassador for you, NIL. And the NCAA imposes some NIL rules, originally. They have these, and they're kind of pseudo suspended right now. Right? And the question is becoming, maybe this is the question for all of us and here and the panelists is, who should actually regulate this? Should it be the NCAA? Should it be a pseudo government agency? Should it be a new agency that's brought up? Should it be the universities? Like, who should be regulating this NIL?
Well, we had some compliance office conversations my last year. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of it being regulated by the NCAA. I'm always wary to trust people who tell you they have their best interest at heart when they don't really know what's going on. That's, I believe in the intentions, but sometimes intentions fall by the wayside if you're not competent. And I feel like that's what happened my senior year. And not people here, but just that whole fiasco. What I think is a huge thing, and I've often thought, are there going to be athletes who get sued sometime in the future? I have seen so many athletes sign like a $700,000 to come play quarterback here at Mississippi State or whatever. And they sign this deal with this company, a third-party company, right? And they don't fulfill on any of their deliverables that the company says, because so it's not pay for play. You have to do something for me, and I give you the money, right? That was my contract. I had to post on Instagram, and then I had to show up and give a speech here, and then I would get the $1,000, right? I mean, athletes, you're talking about 18-year-old kids who have never really had a job. They're getting paid $100,000, and they have to post on Instagram 3 times. They have to show up here and here and here, and then they just don't do it. And I've seen that happen. That has happening all over the place. So I've often thought, are a bunch of these athletes going to get sued? But from people that I've talked to who have been burnt by it, they're like, I'm not going to sue a 18-year-old athlete. You know what I mean? So I feel like that is regulated in and of itself by the company that is part of that deal. You can void the contract if this athlete doesn't fulfill with his deliverables. And that happens a lot, because these athletes aren't really, they just want the money. They don't care about company a lot of times. And so they're not really into that deal. So I've often thought, are these contracts going to be voided? And if they are, then it's the athlete's fault. Anyways. So I don't, that's who I think regulates it.
The free market. For Britain's vote is free market, right?
When it comes to the financials, yes.
And going along with Britain, we're looking at a narrow slice of this pie at the major university level. 2 years ago, I had exposure to a high school program down in Atlanta, Georgia, that was being run by Ted Turner's son-in-law, where the high school athletes were making 7 figures a year doing NIL, and I put that in air quotes. Now, also, those high school athletes are not eligible to play in college when they matriculate from high school. So, looking at what Professor Contreras said, is the NCAA going to face an antitrust action by barring those kids from operating under a system that's allowed at the college level? And it also, to me, demonstrates the separation of student athlete from professional athlete. But that might be subject for next year's conference. I don't know.
We are.
How do you regulate it? How do you regulate college and not high school? I don't know.
That's a good question. It's a good question, and I'm just waiting to sue the Utah High School Activities Association again. I've only done it like 5 times. Why not one more? I'm just joking. I'm not. We are finishing our panel 1 discussion, and now we're going to invite some other guests up here to the front, and we're going to take a 5-minute break. Have some new guests that are going to join our current panel, and then we're going to continue. So we're going to take a 5-minute break.
And I know a bunch of people have contributed Slido questions. Well, some of them are more frankly germane, I think, to the second panel. For the other ones, frankly, the discussion has been so active that we just haven't got to them. So we'll try and do that. To the extent we don't, I'll pass it along to the speakers, and maybe some of them will at some point be willing to respond.
All right, well, welcome back. We have added some, you probably couldn't guess by looking at the panel who we added, but I was going to have Maddie introduce our additions to the panel.
Yes, I would love to introduce these guys to you. These are 2 of our football players at the University of Utah. On the far right is Caleb Lomu. He's an offensive lineman. And just to his left is Keanu Tanavasa, and he is a defensive tackle. And we are thrilled that they are here. They are here representing the Utah football team as well as the collective.
How much are you getting paid in NIL to be here? I'm just kidding.
Don't answer that question.
I don't even make NIL money, actually. No, I'm just kidding.
So Maddie, let me start with you since you just were talking to us. Let's start with this. Explain collectives to us. What are collectives? How are they set up? How do they operate? How do they generate finances? I'm sure there's different ways. You want to talk about Crimson Collective, and then we can ask Russ about all the other collectives, all the other 34 of them that exist.
Yes, I wish I had a generic answer for you on what a collective is, but there are so many types. Every state, every university operates differently. Collectives operate differently from sport to sport, but it's basically a collection of people, usually boosters, who come together to help promote players and assist athletes in generating name, image, and likeness revenue. So in a nutshell, that is what a collective is, what it's meant to do.
Russ, is there different ways to set up a collective?
Oh yeah. There's lots of different ways to set up a collective. I would say that Maddie's definition is perfect. It is different everywhere you go. Every collective is a little bit different. One trend we're seeing nationwide is universities are pushing for consolidation so that there is one collective per school. That's kind of the goal. I think operationally it makes sense. I think getting the boosters in line, it makes sense. I think bringing clarity to where people can put their money, it makes sense. Where athletes know where to go for these opportunities. And I think, so we're seeing in a lot of universities, maybe 3-4 collectives, one for the lacrosse team, one for the basketball team, one for the football team, and they're all being brought together in one. There's an announcement just happened yesterday, I think. Tomorrow, official launch at the University of Colorado of their new combined collective, one that we work with pretty closely. So it's happening all over. Crimson
Is it called the Pride Collective?
It's
Prime
the
Collective?
Prime Collective. You know, it's funny. He's another example, kind of like my good friend, Coach Nick Saban, that we talked about earlier, that, has a lot to say about NIL. And then as soon as there's a collective ready to go, he loves it. It's his favorite thing in the world. So, but it is, he has endorsed it. It'll be a big get for him and his efforts up there as used to be the king of the portal. Now I think he might be the prince of the portal, looking up at Lane Kiffin and some others. But, he'll do his work. So.
Let me ask this question. Anyone can answer it if they know the answer. Is I know that boosters generally and fans are the ones that are contributing to these collectives, but I also understand that collectives are starting to create their own revenue generating businesses so that they don't always have to rely on boosters and fans. Does anyone want to describe any of those that exist out there that they know of? I don't know if the Crimson Collective has one. I can push you to some if you want.
So we don't have a business within the Crimson Collective, but what we do have, what we just implemented, is a subscription base. And so now, previously it was like anybody could donate money and it would just go to the collective. And now with this subscription base, you donate money and you actually get something in return. So it's taken the nonprofit out of it a little bit and changed it into a model where the fan, the everyday person that wants to donate to the collective, is actually getting stuff in return. So that's kind of changed the model a little bit. But as far as like the business side of things, I haven't seen that yet, but I'm very intrigued by that possibility.
Yeah, there's a lot of revenue models being implemented. I mean, donor fatigue is a buzzword or phrase that you'll hear a lot in this space, and it's a real thing. Universities are hitting donors up for money. Individual programs need money. Athletes need money. And so you can't continue to go to the same well over and over and expect new money to pop up. So everything from, membership programs like Maddie just talked about, those are a big revenue generating stream for collectives. Appearances, events, holding mass events. It's interesting because fans, have been very vocal about wanting to be involved and how can I contribute. And then fans complain about, why do I have to pay for the kids to be here? But it's, being able to build out a program with events and a membership program that gives benefits back to the fans, I think is a win for everybody. You're getting into licensing, group licensing, collective wide, merchandise. One interesting idea, spirits, branded spirits. You're seeing a lot of official whiskeys and vodkas and things at different collectives that a percentage of the sale goes back to the collective across the country. So really it's any way you can generate kind of a recurring revenue stream or a revenue stream outside of just donors writing a check, I think is valuable to build the overall business of a collective.
So Keanu and Caleb, whoever wants to go first on this, but we probably all want to know from you guys, how has NIL benefited you here as a collegiate athlete?
It's definitely benefited me in a lot of ways. Sorry. Like before college football, like without NIL, I feel like trying to make money would be like super hard. Like we still have guys on the team who like have second job because football is our job. And so I feel like it's super beneficial in that way where we're able to leave college with some money to have and not have to get like a second job to try and earn some money. Like I heard a story, I forgot which quarterback it was, but Bryce Young, maybe he was like a DoorDash on the side, like before NIL was a thing. So it's just super beneficial in the way to like we're able to make a little bit of money while doing our job, which is very like time consuming and it'd be hard to have like another thing to try and take care of.
My first year, I always say I signed at the wrong time because I signed in 2020 before NIL was a thing.
Britton said the same thing earlier.
Yeah, we signed at the wrong time. If I had signed Caleb year, I would have loved it. But my first 2 years of college, I wasn't making any NIL money. So my first 2 years of playing, being on the team, and it's a very taxing program and a very time-consuming job that you're a part of, consistently traveling, flying, you don't make time, you try to make classes, you try to stay awake for classes when you're in class. And so there's a lot of things that kind of overtake you as an athlete. And then when you have free time, it's often spent to recover. And so the difficulty is when there's those times that you have off, like the month of May, and you want to get home, there's little time that you realize that I didn't make enough money, or I didn't even save money when we weren't making NIL to pay enough for a flight ticket to get back home. My school was paid for by my scholarship, but I didn't actually collect any money to be able to pay for my flight back home. And so prior to making NIL, it made trips home, it made personal items and personal opportunities to connect and be with family very difficult. And so now having that opportunity with NIL, when the opportunity arises, there's definitely blessings there that come from having that NIL money that I'm able to reconnect with people that I wasn't able to prior when I wasn't making NIL money.
Do you guys get to decide what businesses that you work with and get your name, image, and likeness from the collective, or does the collective make that decision for you guys?
So that's there's different ways that I think different companies go about it. I think some target certain people. Like I know Caleb's a really good speaker, and so there's probably some companies that want very good talkers, whereas I could speak for other of my teammates that are more reserved, right? And so those type of companies, it's not that they don't want them, it's just that that's not the way that they try to live their life. They're more of a reserved individual. But we do at the same time also get to participate in the events that we want to, like the Huntsman Cancer Patients, which is one of mine and Caleb's favorite, when we get to go participate and enjoy spending time with kids with cancer and those types of things. Or we have Sammy's Buddy program where we get to go to the schools and visit with the Sammy's Buddy program kids, and it's just a blast hanging out with those kids. So we do get to participate a little bit, but at the same time, I think there is some companies that understand what they're looking for in an athlete as well. But the collective helps us with that overall.
Do you guys get to hustle to these businesses either and try to bring them into the collective? Like you want to, like Britton was talking to us about how, first year of Wild Wild West NIL, he was trying to get businesses or people that join on, using his name, image, and likeness and going and speaking. Do you guys have to do that, or does the collective do all the work for you in that regard?
It's probably not hard with a name like Britton Covey. Maybe if I played and looked like him, I would be able to get into contact with companies more. But no, there's definitely opportunities that the collective provides for us to make connections and to network in that way. Relationships, my parents always tell me, is what builds the future. Your relationships is about who you know and not about what you have. But the collective definitely helps us with that, for sure.
You have any thoughts, Caleb?
That's all spot on right there. Like the collective for sure helps out a ton, especially for me. I'm just a freshman, so it's kind of, I don't know too much about the whole, like just getting into college and the whole NIL thing. I don't know like too much about it. Same with everyone else because it's a newer thing. So having the help from the Crimson Collective is just like very useful and helpful to have. I'm sure there's like other businesses that like contact you individually, just like what he was saying. Some people are more like outspoken, or some people are kind of to themselves, so they want those specific type of people. And so it's just like for me, like being in my first year, it's very nice to have the Crimson helping out with just like everything, and they make it very easy for me.
So Maddie, Russ, Britton, if you know the answer on this, so do these collectives, do they become some type of, I know there's been some objections to these collectives. And so I'm asking, I don't know if this is one of those objections, but it is. But is this total control over these young men's name, image, and likeness so that they don't get a say in, somebody comes to them directly and wants to strike a deal with them? Do they have to go to the collective to use the name, image, and likeness? I mean, you guys want to speak on that? Because there's been some criticism on some of this.
I think I'll let Russ speak more to collectives outside of the University of Utah, but the thing that I love the most about our collective, and by the way, I paid these two to say all those nice things, so thanks, guys. But the thing that I love the most about our collective is that we are a nonprofit, so we work solely with charities. We have about 7 charities that we've signed. And these guys and their teammates go to these events and they promote these charities, and it's all nonprofit work with the Utah Crimson Collective. And so they are free to go out and network, doing events like this, going and talking to other businesses to promote their own name, image, and likeness, and we don't hold them to solely working with us. They can kind of spread their wings and go earn their own money in different ways outside of what our collective does.
No collective should be requiring any type of exclusivity on an athlete at all. No members, to my knowledge, in the collective association require that. There are some collectives that have group licensing deals with the members that they support, that they can then go out and obviously do deals as a group, that maybe if there was a conflicting deal that came through, an athlete would need to bring that to their attention, but definitely should not be requiring any type of exclusivity, because the collective piece should be in addition to other NIL opportunities that come to these athletes. There has been in the past that I'm aware of a couple of collectives that have crossed that line that have been that have had issues arise from that, and I just don't think that that's in line with the way that this space, as it more professionalizes going forward, that we won't see a lot of that, and we shouldn't be limited to work with one group. As an agency on our side of things, like Britton said that we work with him on the marketing side of things, even as an agency we don't require marketing exclusivity of our athletes, because if they have someone come directly to them and say, hey, come make this appearance and I'll pay you X dollars, why should I get a cut of that? Why should the collective have control over these athletes? Some collectives do what they call marketing agreements or marketing guarantees, where they'll guarantee X dollars and then they're able to go pitch brands for the athlete to have deliverables kind of backfill those expectations. But as far as control over what they can and can't do, no.
So Britton, you've had the chance in the NFL. I assume you're part of the Players Association. Do you think an association like a union for collegiate athletes would be beneficial in this space? As we talk about NIL, you brought up the transfer portal. You're talking about and the NCAA not really having the best interest of athletes. in mind. Do you think something that you've experienced in the NFL, like a players association, would be beneficial?
Yes, I do. I think it would be a lot more challenging, obviously, than the NFL. So I actually was just at the NFLPA conference 2 weeks ago in Arizona. And a lot of these discussions that we're having here, we have there. It's just a lot more organized because all the boundaries are a lot clearer. So until things are really clear, it might be difficult to really organize an effective players association. But I mean, even things, I think, like kind of Russ said, the idea of getting collectives, singular collectives in every school, is almost the first step to me to kind of things going in the right direction, because it does eliminate a lot of chaos. I'm all in favor of collectives, especially because they're non-exclusive, and I think it eliminates some of the chaos. And then after that, players associations are more likely. But also, like Russ said, with collectives, donor fatigue, things like that are very real. This is another reason why I think the free market is the regulator, because what happens when someone pays the collective $2 million and says, okay, I want this money specifically to go to the football program and to this receiver, and then this receiver comes and he's not very good, that donor is going to be a lot less willing to put his money here. Or say the receiver is good, but he does nothing in return for this company. That donor is going to be a lot less willing. So it will regulate itself a little bit.
So let me ask this for everybody on the panel. I've got two questions, and then we obviously have some questions that the audience and those online have given us as well. Has NIL leveled the playing field in collegiate sports? You know, this has been one of the things that those people, whoever those people might be, say that the reason why Nick Saban bowed out was finally it was not him dominating this anymore. He finally had to now compete against others. That's what they say. I don't know if it's true. But has it leveled the playing field?
My immediate knee-jerk opinion is no. I think it's interesting because I think it's made the Power Four now. I think it's made them more competitive with each other, but I think it's broadened the gap between the Power Four and all of the smaller schools. Unless you've got a smaller school with a really famous alumni that has a chunk of change that they want to put into the collective and the programs, I think it's broadened that gap, but I think it's somewhat closed the gap on the bigger named schools and programs.
And I will throw in my thing again, that the reason is more the transfer portal than NIL, because what happens when you get a Damian Lillard who goes to Weber State because he's under-recruited? I was under-recruited, right? I didn't have as many offers coming out. So yeah, Power Fours become more competitive. You still get these kids that kind of fall under the wayside because they're not heavily recruited and they're stars, right? You get a Damian Lillard go to Weber State. A Damian Lillard would never stay 4 years at Weber State anymore. Nowadays, he plays 1 year, gets noticed on a national stage, and a Big 12 school picks him up for $500,000. Once again, that's why I think the transfer portal is the bigger thing, because the gap is going to be so big between the Power Four and the other ones, because there's not a single player who does well in the Power Four or in the lower level who ever stay there anymore. They're going to get offers from every Power Four conference. So, but I agree. I don't think it's in the other ones. It's not as much.
I'd throw in. I would agree with what you said. Power Four definitely. It's spread the talent out. It has and will continue, I think, to build that gap between the Power Four and everybody else. I think that the whole idea that the NCAA's structure and governance prior to this was that every division should be run by the same rules and regulations was off base from the beginning. I think that there's always been different issues and challenges at each level, where Power Four now should probably be governed by a little bit set of different rules than the Group of Five or whatever that next name will be for that group. different set of rules than maybe Division II, Division III on down, because the NCAA really serves, is supposed to serve institutions on all levels. That being said, I think that we see, non-traditional powers, as George in his introduction mentioned kind of the haves and the have-nots. And it was funny because the schools that you mentioned as the haves, kind of the USC, Florida, and I forget who the third one was. But in my mind, I'm looking back through those aren't even three of the biggest collectives and really schools that are growing and building up, which is crazy because they're the biggest name brands, but they're not the ones who are trying to, make a huge difference right now as much. So it's an interesting thing because I think within that Power Four, the talent's being spread out, but there are different brands that are popping up or different universities that are more aggressive maybe than others. But yeah, between Power Four and the next level, it's definitely widening that gap, unfortunately.
So let me ask Caleb and Keanu, did NIL play a part in your recruiting to come here, your decision making?
For me, not at all. No, I've never really been a person just to go to a school just for that reason. I still wanted to go to the school where I'll be most developed because that's all that matters. You can go to a school, pay you more, but if you don't get developed the way you can get developed, and then you kind of just fall and never get better, I feel like all that money's kind of useless. And so I wanted to go to a place where I could still get, because the end goal for me, I want to be in the NFL, and that's where I want to make all my money. And so I want to get developed at the school where Utah, this is where I wanted to be. The coaching staff, I know they'll get me to where I need to be, and I know I'll get developed the way I want to, and know I can be developed. And so NIL played nothing in it for me. I'm also LDS, so being here was also a big reason for me. And so I had all these, I had a bunch of little reasons, but NIL never factored or came into the question for me. I just wanted to go to a place where I know will help me get to my end goal.
I think for me, as I stated, NIL wasn't really a thing when I was in high school. It was something that was under the rug. It was, you would hear about players, when they got there, they would be promised certain things. I think the difference is, kind of addressing what Britton said, is what keeps me here, so I had a really good year last year, and I had the opportunity from certain schools that I could have transferred, and I would have made a whole lot more money than I currently am making here. But what keeps me at Utah is not the NIL money. Similar to Caleb, there's a family aspect here, and then there's a developmental aspect at the U, a part of its culture that develops characters to a certain extent that is completely different than you would find anywhere else. I truthfully believe, being here for going on my third year, that this is the greatest culture that you can find in college football history. And, you could say that because I'm biased because I'm a part of it and I love my team. But I think, if I'm being honest, as a high school kid, still being immature prior to me serving a mission, I think NIL could easily sway my high school mind. And I think that's why I relied so much upon my parents at the time, even when NIL wasn't a big thing. But if I'm a high school kid getting offered $500,000 to, USC, and I'm only getting offered $50,000 or just a scholarship to go to Utah, as a high school kid, I can't say that my mind wouldn't be swayed to go to USC. But now with the maturity and understanding that I have of being here, it's easy to turn down that money to stay at the U. And that's just my honest opinion.
No, that's good. So Britton, I know that you've talked to us earlier about it was only the last year that you were here, wasn't even developed. If you were playing right now, especially, how you were as a collegiate athlete here at the U, where would you be on this? So, we all love you. We're not going to hate you for this answer. We want you to be honest. But would have played a difference in your mind, NIL, if you were offered some of the money that you probably could have made somewhere else to leave the U?
I don't know how it couldn't. Obviously, these are two of the best guys you'll meet, right? The majority of the population does not think the way that he thinks. The majority of the population is going in at the end of a good year and basically threatening to transfer unless you can match or almost match what you've been offered. And like I think that short-term style of thinking is actually very damaging for kids. And I've seen, even my last year, I saw so many kids transfer into the U, and this was their second time transferring, and it's just the grass is not always greener, even though it seems like it. So I think it's very wise, but not all kids think like that. In fact, the vast majority don't. And this is where I think that it's great for the top earners, right? But the 90 whatever percent of kids that aren't making that, it's just this facade of the grass is always greener. And then I see kids' college careers always ending up, and this is where I am a little more old fashioned. It ends up how they don't want it to be. They don't play, or they have to change schools 3 different times. And then all of a sudden they don't even know what their major is. And then their family, their whole purpose and identity is wrapped up in if they're playing on the football field. So it's tough. That's overlooked a lot. I don't know if I would have been much different if it were in high school, and I do not blame any player or any kid for wanting to, especially when a lot of families aren't as well off or whatever, like wanting to go after. I've known lots of players who their parents are almost relying on an 18-year-old kid to go make this much money. Really hard for an 18-year-old kid to be put on their shoulders that. And so I don't blame the players at all for chasing that. I just think that it's hard to put long-term mentality into their young minds. And so I don't know what the answer is. That's why these conversations are very interesting. I don't know what the answers are, but there are a lot of things that come with each decision.
Excuse me, I do also think that it's going to be a cultural shift too. I think that you have the Keanus and the Calebs who were early on in NIL, who came in and they love the culture and they're here. And I think that as we move forward and as NIL becomes prevalent and it's the first thing on people's mind, I talked to Coach Whittingham the other day, and we were speaking about how 5 years ago when I was the creative director, we would pour weeks and weeks and weeks into this presentation on an iPad that they would take into these homes and show these kids. It talked about academics, it talked about the college, it talked about, it talked about all of these wonderful aspects about the university that made them want to come here. And now that presentation isn't shown anymore. It's moving in the direction of solely speaking about NIL. And I think with Utah, it's different because we've had this coaching staff around for such a long time. I mean, we're blessed. We have a wonderful coaching staff, which I think helps recruit amazing kids to our program. But I do think we will see a cultural shift of it will become solely about the money that kids will make when they come and less about the culture. And I won't repeat any of the transfer portal stuff, but it will become about the transfer portal and moving to where you can make the most money.
That's good. We have some questions from the audience.
We do. And the first one, I think, goes to a comment Maddie made in the first panel. And someone said, don't leave us on the cliffhanger about the international students.
So F1 visas to come here and play from an international, there's some restrictions with them, Maddie.
Yes. I'm very excited to tell you guys that we just paid our very first international student at the University of Utah. It was quite complicated. We bought him a ticket to New Zealand. He flew to New Zealand. He spent a week there with his family. He did a ton of work. We did a vlog. We had him sign a bunch of autographs. We had to film him signing the autographs. He had to mail them back. He had to have them stamped. It was a whole thing, but we did successfully pay him, which was a huge win for us. But yes, it's very complicated. Oh, we paid him too. I forgot about that guy. Yes, we did pay an international student last year, but we're learning so much about how to get around these F1 visa rules because
how to work with these F1 visas.
Work with. Yes, work with. Don't sue me. So
you're going to be calling me. That's all I'm just saying.
We talked a lot about active versus passive work. So one of our players last year, it's what's considered active versus what's considered passive. And if you're in the United States, the work has to be passive. So for example, I could take Thomas Yasmin's phone and I could send a tweet from his account, but I have to type the tweet and I have to press tweet. And that's considered passive work for him because he didn't actually do the work, but he's still promoting the collective. Whereas active work is actually him typing the tweet. So I'm learning a lot about this, and I think the lawyers should maybe take this one off my plate. But yes, we are learning, and we are learning how to work with these rules.
Does one of the lawyers want to take that off her plate? Seemed like an offer.
I'm not an immigration attorney.
No, fair enough. Okay, the next question I think is actually something that's sort of been raised tangentially, and maybe for the two athletes on the panel first, is do you think NIL has affected the camaraderie within your teams, in particular where you may have a player who is very high profile, maybe is making additional sums, and then there are players who are very low profile. Do you think it affects that camaraderie, that esprit de corps?
I would like see how that's a good point. It would seem like that, but at Utah, no, not at all. At Utah, no matter who you are, it's everyone's a family at Utah. I went to a lot of schools, like visit other schools, and the family atmosphere that you feel like here at Utah is not like anything else. Like no matter who, like we have a Cam Rising, he's the nicest guy. He'll go around talking to anyone, doesn't matter who you are. So that, for Utah at least, I don't know about other schools, but that has not, in my opinion, I have not seen that affect anything around, like the players, coaches, or anything.
I agree with Caleb. One of my best. We share lockers right next to each other, but I also disagree. I do have a little bit more experience considering I'm going into my third year and he's still entering his first. And I can say that within myself, I think it causes even a little bit of division last year when I wasn't making money. And I had seen freshmen that would join the team and they were, playing a certain position and they were 5th on the roster, 6th on the roster, and they were on the scout team. And I had heard that they were making heaps of money. And I was struggling to still, finance out my scholarship and figure out how I wanted to pay for my gas and my groceries at the time and pay my rent. And then how was I going to get my ticket to get home, so I could go visit my family on the breaks. And there were these guys that didn't play when I was a starting athlete and they were getting paid consistently. And so I think within myself, it allowed, the natural man, the natural, selfishness that we try to avoid to take over at times. And that was difficult. I think that's difficult to deal with. And I think that a lot of college athletes probably deal with that. I think that definitely would affect a lot of camaraderie on the team, that they're no longer a unit, that they can be very divisive towards each other because they're being judgmental. And that's human nature, is to judge someone else because they have something that I don't have. Just like Caleb said, though, I would agree that the culture at Utah has been set, and we have amazing individuals like Cam Rising, amazing individuals like Brant Keithy, like Karene Reed, who we know are stars on the team, who do make more money than us, but they don't act like it. I think that's where the defining line is how do the people that make money act? I can't speak for, certain quarterbacks that I played against that I know act a certain type of way than when they make money, and they're difficult sometimes dealing with those people when they paint their nails and, and I don't know if I could imagine being somewhere else outside of Utah because I know the environment that there is with the NIL activity here. And I also have friends that play for Texas and Washington and USC, and I understand what the culture is like there. And I'm sure it would be difficult and very divisive over there, but I know that at least over here we keep it really real and genuine, and that actually NIL talk is something that is very minuscule in the locker room. It's very unheard of. It was not until last year when I actually sought after it through through the relationships that I had that I finally understood more about what players were actually making. But when I had learned of younger players making more than me, who I believed was more so a veteran that had worked to at least make some compensation, it was very divisive to me. But it's understandable. And so I would say we don't have that culture here that's poisoning us. It might at some point, but the coaches do a very good job of getting that out. But I can see how the camaraderie in other places would be very divided because of NIL money.
Yeah, this is a interesting topic because, once again, I think this is where the market does correct itself a little bit. A freshman gets paid $100,000 and then doesn't play. He's fifth on the depth chart. I know, once again, these are two of the best guys you'll ever meet. I know across locker rooms in America, it does create division when someone is starting and their backup, maybe even the third string guy, is getting paid 5 times as much as them. I would be frustrated with that, 100%. And I think donors are going to be a lot less willing to put out money if the guy's not going to really show it on the field. Then where you transition into is, okay, well then do we have something, whether it's in our collective coaching staff, that if you're a starter, then you make this much. But then is that pay for play, right? This is where it gets tricky because I've seen a lot of coaches want to say, okay, well, one of the incentives that we'll give not only to a recruit, not only on top of the NIL deal that you might get for $100,000, if you're a starter, if you're a starting lineman, every starting lineman gets $15,000. Every starting receiver gets $25,000, right? Because receivers are way more important than linemen, of course. I'm just kidding. It's a total joke. But right, and I think that would be an effective way to stop some of the division. But is that pay for play? But if it's not specific to the athlete, if it's kind of like a preset rule, I don't think it is, and I think that something like that would be effective. Anyways.
The pay for play, pay for performance, little pieces of the NIL, the NCAA's interim policy are often debated, right? A structure like that, is that pay for play, is that pay for performance? You can have a contract with an athlete who, if they get X number of touchdowns, they get a certain amount of money. You cannot have that deal. Mm-hmm. But University of Texas had a collective that launched, and it's now been folded into their big one, but that was called, I believe it was called Horns with Heart. They paid every offensive lineman on the roster $50,000. Said if you're an O lineman, doesn't matter if you start or the last guy here, you're making $50,000. You'll go up from there based off how much we utilize you in the community. And so those numbers differed, but everyone kind of started at the same level, right? And so it's an interesting kind of, how close are we getting to? And there are collectives, I've seen the sheets where it's similar to a general manager in an NFL team, where it's position by position. Yep. I've seen ones that pricing sheets that are pricing sheets, but salary cap structure sheets, I guess you can call them, that would say, if this kid is a 5-star recruit and it's their second year now in the program and they started more than 6 games or less than 6 games, and there's just little pieces that you just add it up and that's what you offer them. And there are some collectives operating that way. I mean, it's interesting. Everyone structures it differently in how it works, but to hear that, and again, we spoke earlier to Utah's culture. I think Coach Whittingham, Coach Scally, those guys have done an incredible job of creating an amazing culture here that's unique to Utah. Other places don't have that, and I'm sure there are issues at other universities, but to hear that from these two guys, I think that shows just the difference in each individual athlete's NIL journey and experience, right? Like, they're in the same locker room. He's been here going into his 3rd season, brand new. They have a little bit different view on NIL. They have a little bit different view on how much it bothers them or worries them, things like that. But they both are very appreciative for it and the opportunities that it brings.
One last one from the audience, which, we're a law school, so let's ask a law question. With the student athletes, and not only at the initial organization, not only in their relationship with their local collective, but I also suppose once they're looking at a portal deal, who's representing them and their interests, and particularly the legal interests for whatever deals they are or aren't striking? And so maybe those are 3 different levels, right? So like for Crimson Collective, the internal deals Are they represented independently, or does Crimson Collective represent them? Those initial negotiations, maybe when you're entering school, and then those negotiations into the portal.
I can speak a little bit to this. I know for the collective, we negotiate with them as far as the compensation that they'll get from the collective, but I feel like we're seeing a trend in a lot of players picking up agents in college. The first year of NIL, no player had agents. And I think there were some restrictions around that. You could have a marketing agent, but you couldn't have an agent that would take you into the NFL. But when a player is represented by an agent, they do their negotiations and they assist in the negotiation with the collective as well as within the portal. If a player is not represented by an agent, they are usually doing it themselves or with help I've seen help from family members, from friends that happen to be lawyers. We've kind of seen the gamut, but I do feel like it's trending in the direction of players all being represented by an agent of some kind because the negotiations and the contracts are getting more and more complicated and more in-depth the further into this that we get.
I would recommend that athletes work with agents on these types of deals. So it's not until recently that you've seen, well, the majority of agents take commissions on collective deals. They have started to now, a lot of them have. Prior to that, a lot of them, like a marketing agent, so like with Britain, the collective wasn't here with Britain, but if Crimson Collective were around and they wanted to make an offer to Britain, they probably would have spoken to Britain. He would have brought us into the conversation. We would have negotiated it. We wouldn't have taken a commission. The money would have gone to Britain. That's becoming more and more professionalized in that agencies will take a small commission, similar to the NFLPA. I think it limits like 3%. So like a marketing deal, if we bring a marketing deal to an athlete, we're going to take 20% of that deal because that's a standard marketing percentage. A collective deal, we're going to take 2 to 3% of that deal to negotiate it, make sure the terms are in line, the athlete fully understands what they're signing, etc. I think that athletes should have representation on things like that. And again, a lot of it could be educational for athletes to understand the value that those agents bring in those types of things, that it's not something they have to pay for up front, it's a portion of what they get, et cetera. But we're seeing across the country a lot more athletes work with representation or attorneys or whomever, which I think is smart because most professionals or most people that were dealing with those amount of that amount of money would hire someone to help them negotiate a deal that works for them. So.
And I will say that I think that a lot of kids, a lot of 18-year-olds, when they have a contract in front of them, they will sign it. They won't read it. If they don't have representation, they won't understand the terms. There was a player that I believe a school in Florida, I can't remember, but his contract that he signed stated that for the rest of his life, any money that he earned, he had to pay 10% back to the university for the remainder of his life. I'm not sure if he got out of that contract. I'll have to look that up, but
Sounds
that's
unconscionable.
Yes, I mean, that is a terrible thing. But a lot of these guys think, like Britton mentioned earlier, people say, I have your best interest in mind, sign this contract. They sign it. That's it. So I do agree with Russ. I think that the deeper we get into this, the more important it is to have representation and have people that are willing to look over contracts and make sure that, protect these guys and make sure that they're in good shape and that in good standing and that they don't give 10% of their income away for the remainder of their existence.
One thing I'll throw on that real quick. Universities have been limited on what resources they can provide to the athletes. So a university cannot provide they cannot provide these guys legal assistance in reviewing contracts, which I think, again, an NCAA rule that does not serve the best interests of the athlete. Collectives have been known, depending on the collective, to advise on contracts for outside deals that come to the athlete, just as a service. Like, hey, we'll look that deal over for you to make sure it's in line. Obviously, if they're negotiating with the collective, that's a conflict, so there's got to be somebody else in there. But I think that is one area where the NCAA, or at least the member institutions, can step up in providing more resources for the athletes, is give them access to people to review these contracts. I'm sure at the law school, you probably have some students who would love the experience of looking over a contract under the, the direction of.
As long as Trinity's agreed to supervise them, I'll permit it.
But it's a service that would be very valuable to the athletes. And I think that there's easy ways to fix some of these things like that.
Yeah, and that's some of the stuff that I've seen just in the space is, our firm has represented athletes across the board, from professional athletes to collegiate athletes, and providing those services to them is contract review, just looking out for their best interest. And the other thing I'll bring up, we're talking about the legal aspect of these contracts. I've heard the stories of, in fact, this is literally the exact story I heard was, tax time came and young athlete came up and said, I got a bill from tax. They're like, what? I got a bill from tax. And what do you mean you got a bill from tax? I got to pay taxes. I didn't know that. Thought the collective was paying their taxes for him as well. And so providing accounting and tax services, that this is something the NCAA does not allow the schools to give. So this has to come from somewhere else. And there has to be those resources or those avenues, or pointing them in that direction of, here's some professionals. Britain, it's probably a little bit different in the NFL world, where everyone's knocking on your door trying to provide those services for you. But can you speak a little bit to this?
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of college athletes don't know what taxes are, right? And in the NFL, it's a W-2, right? It's already taken out. You don't got to do anything. Anything NIL is more 1099 type of stuff, and you got to do it yourself, and it's a lot more difficult, I feel like. So yes, I experienced that myself, and so I know a lot of athletes are. I don't know if, I'm so far removed, 3 whole years from college, but I don't know if the university offers things like that. I think it would be important.
That is something that the collective tries to help with, and I know that they have a great player development program at the University of Utah that provides some of this education. But to that point, and to a similar point of putting a contract in front of an 18-year-old that's never seen a contract before, taxes are the same. So we did all of our negotiations in January, and I was responsible for taking the contracts up, meeting with these guys, having them sign the contract. And most of them I said, so just FYI, maybe keep 30% of this away, because we 1099 them. They're not W-2'd. It doesn't automatically come out of their paycheck. And I think the majority of the looks on the faces of these athletes was just like, oh my gosh, why? And it's like, well, you have to pay taxes, and trying to walk them through that process. And now the university has put in awesome resources for these guys to learn about taxes, to actually have someone come in weekly and educate them on what they need to be putting away, how to go about doing your taxes, all of that stuff. So it is getting better, and I think it's like NIL as a whole, it's a learning curve for sure.
Well, I got one last question as we close up here, and it's Caleb. It's actually for you. Keanu talked to us, and maybe they're the same, but he told us about all of his favorite charities that he gets to get out and do work for. What about you? Do you have some favorite charities and work that you get to do in the NIL world?
Mine for sure is the Sammy's Buddies program. All the opportunities that we have to go hang out with these kids. We get to go to their school. We did a polar plunge where it's freezing. It was miserable, but it was super fun. We got to go hang out with all these kids and all these people and just spend time with them. It benefits them, but it benefits us a lot too, just being able to be there with them. And it's super fun. We'll go, they'll have pizza at the end, so makes it all worth it, of course. But just being with these kids and just hanging out with them is it's just so fun. And these kids are all hilarious too. There's some funny ones out there. But for sure the Sammy's Buggy program would be my favorite. The Hudson Cancer Institution too. That one's amazing. Be able to go to the hospital and just hang out with those kids. So it's those two for sure are my favorite.
That's great. Well, guys, thank you all for being here. Thank you for viewing us online. We have a reception now that we've got some food. I don't know if it's pizza, but we got some food for you, Caleb. And it's going to be just right out these doors to my left, your right. So thank you for being here.
Thanks, everyone.